thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to meet other academics and scholars doing very important work. I will preface that this talk is also funny, so I hope my humor works in Germany. So I hear very funny people are here. So I'll start out a little bit about myself. I studied filmmaking and philosophy at NYU, and I saw this on the street in Los Angeles, and it's not my car actually, but it reminded me of when I did go to Los Angeles in 1999, believe it or not, when I wanted to study film, and by film I mean, you know, rectangular cinema, as you say. And I failed miserably. It was terrible, and I wasn't able to kind of adjust with the culture of the place. But when I saw this, I was going to LA because so much of my post-production for a lot of the projects you see here are there. And this makes me think that there's a parallel universe where I'm a very famous director, you know, need that, you know. But I'm named after the original Gabo, who's a very good writer, and I'm really into literature, as my parents were. My mother was a librarian, and so books were a big part of how I come to think. So as much as I love technology, the written word has this sort of foundational thing in storytelling. But after I went to LA, it's a little bit of a personal journey, so I can be funny, and we'll talk about some serious things. I didn't know what to do with my life, you know. It happens. I was 22, and so I decided to go to Latin America and teach yoga, you know, and meditation. So there's a lot of pictures of me much thinner and younger, but don't be too shocked. So I spent a lot of my time in Latin America, and that actually comes back into a little bit of my foundational myth of what happens with virtual reality. So a little bit about where I want to begin. I eventually, after a lot of adventuring around the world, you know, as one does when you learn languages and cultures, you know, you end up at the UN, you know, it's a way. The UN is two types of people, you know. There's the people who come in as diplomats from civil service, you know, so they are suits and ties and they go into the UN to do diplomacy. And then there's the humanitarian workers that come from the ground up, you know. And so for me, I was very much coming from a lot of humanitarian work that eventually led me there. But while I was at the UN, I, you know, had been on the field, but when I was in New York especially, I realized when we wanted to make a difference, when we wanted to get the word out, and I was at the UN from 2009 to 2017, to give you some context, we would go to celebrities, you know. That was the way we were able to kind of, it was the default way was contact George Clooney, write an op-ed, and let's do a press conference, you know. And I just kept thinking, the world is changing, there was so much stuff happening on YouTube, but if you looked at the UN's YouTube channel, and even now, it's abysmal numbers, you know. It's just, there's just a dearth of storytelling there. I don't have to go on to say that, you know, the UN is a dinosaur, you know. And I think a lot of it was because so much of the storytelling was about donors, really. It was to say, it wasn't thinking about the general public. It was more inside to kind of express, oh, look what we're doing, look how great we are, rather than, you know, really give the microphone or really kind of center people's stories, you know. So for me, a lot of my work was trying to kind of change that narrative. I will say, you know, Angelina Jolie, when she would talk to people, you know, get a little better, 87,000 views, you know. But this is what we're up against, you know, where at some point, you know, I had to, you know, there was a valid concern of whether something like this was even possible. Are people just idiots, you know? Does the internet make us dumb? Can we actually use the internet to actually get stories across? So, you know, around 2013, I convinced the UN to kind of try to do people-centered storytelling that was really around subjects of interest, and to also partner with NGOs that we would work with to do something. So I'm going to, I think you should buckle in, because this is an hour, this thing, but there's going to be movies, so you'll watch things. So this is your first movie coming up of my first sort of viral video that really launched a lot of the storytelling that I did in virtual reality, but I just wanted to play it for you so you could see what it's like.
Life on Earth would not be possible without the oxygen and fresh water generated in places like the Amazon rainforest. But the Amazon is being destroyed by the oil industry for short-term economic gain, threatening the existence of the plants, animals, and people who live in the rainforest.
Ecuador is not going to get out of poverty just because they come and drill for oil in the Amazon. Ecuador is going to lose the only rainforest that we have left. It's going to destroy cultures, the environment, kill animals. That's not getting out of poverty.
The people who live in the Amazon rainforest are doing everything they can to stop the expansion of the oil frontier, but local governments are supporting the oil companies, under the false impression that drilling for oil will get them out of poverty.
If you look at those places where they are drilling oil, those are the regions most people living with terrible health conditions and no education. Those are the regions that are most poor. People thought that they could come here and exploit oil and then just wash their hands and they would move on. But that did not happen. We're a pain in the ass for the government right now. And that makes me hopeful. That makes me know that we can get further. You cannot justify human rights abuses with economical arguments. We are also human beings just as anyone else, and we have the same rights as anyone else to choose our way of life and to have that choice respected.
This is not just a local issue. This is a global issue. If oil companies are allowed to destroy the Amazon, it would permanently change the climate in both South America and North America. This will have devastating consequences for the entire world.
The cycle of the weather has changed here. When it should rain, it doesn't rain. And when it shouldn't rain, it rains. There's a whole system in the forest. It's not just, oh, there are animals living there. It's a whole world, how they interact, how they live, what they eat, where they move. I remember my grandfather saying once that it is from the Amazon that the breath of the world comes. Because without the Amazon, the world would not breathe.
The International Energy Agency has said that if we want to keep global temperatures from increasing, at least half of the world's oil and coal supply should stay in the ground. If something isn't done soon, the world's temperature could permanently increase by 8 degrees, a critical level at which the global ecosystem would move towards an unstoppable collapse. But it's not too late to change this. Citizens from all over the world must come together and urge political leaders to keep the oil in the ground. Go to AmazonWatch.org to learn how you can help protect the Amazon rainforest, and share this video with anyone you know who likes to breathe fresh air. Together we can let our voices be heard and keep our world beautiful.
Okay, so after that experiment, where we didn't know how it would be, that video got 2 million views and was shown at the UN, and it made the government of Ecuador apologize to the Sarayuku community for illegally searching for oil on their land. And it was an amazing experience, and the idea was that I was going to do much more of those. to do a web series and to continue to use that as the model, which is people-centric, and there was a lot of, I think, excitement around it. But then I discovered virtual reality. And it's a very odd thing that when I discovered it, it was 2014, and there weren't commercially available headsets. And all of a sudden, I had my first experience. I met Chris Milk, who's also very well-known in virtual reality, who I partnered with, who gave me my first virtual reality experience. And who here has had a virtual reality experience? I mean, good, it's good. For me, it was quasi-religious. It was, I had seen the future. I felt deeply moved, and I said I wanted to make something in it. And everyone said, they said I was crazy for two reasons. Well, there are many reasons I'm crazy, but the two reasons that were coming to mind at that time were, well, who's going to watch it? How are you going to do this? You know, the whole question of distribution. And secondly, at that time, nobody was really using virtual reality or thinking about it for this type of storytelling or documentary storytelling. It was being thought of more as a roller coaster entertainment and games. But we didn't listen. And in 2014, almost a little over 10 years ago, we went to a Syrian refugee camp in Jordan. And this is an Instagram post from Barry Palisman, who I went with, who was my DP. And we made a film, and we showed it at the World Economic Forum, and it was called Clouds Over Sidra. And it was, you know, kind of an unprecedented thing to do. But the idea was, I knew that when I went through it, I said, even if we reach less people, I feel like we're going to change more people. That these numbers that we see on YouTube, that it's the engagement, you know? I don't know, the hypothesis was that a 2D regular thing is too passive, that there's something here that would just change how people would behave, you know? So I'm going to skip that one right away just because I have another case study. But basically, after we launched this film, it was, you know, a seismic moment for virtual reality, for myself, for a lot of things. Oh, you could see now, sorry. And it really, you know, paved the way forward to no longer do web series, but to now focus on virtual reality exclusively. And it was a little bit of a difficult thing because Samsung gave me 200 virtual reality headsets. And the idea was to launch this film and to do other films that were in 360. So they were not as interactive, and we'll go through some of the differences as the technologies evolved. And the idea was to take these 200 ones and send them to different conferences and send them through different decision makers. So the idea was to focus on, you know, heads of state, secretaries of state, and especially around Syria, you know, trying to, because the UN's constantly asking governments for more money, you know, and has to kind of usually use reports or usually use statistics. But what the Secretary General would do is put people in the headset and then ask for the money. And it was surprising how that worked, you know, and it became a kind of paradigm of fundraising that I'll go into a little bit of what it is. But right away, the topic was, you know, what is this empathy, you know, because Roger Ebert talks about film being the original empathy machine, and many would say literature, you know, great literature is also an empathy machine where you can feel like you're in the shoes of another. So, you know, obviously there's the textbook definition of it, but to me, you know, these were some of the things that I jotted down and I thought about, of it being not about shocking and not about generating pity, but really trying to give people's lived experience. And this was very important. When I first got a virtual reality camera and I started working with it, there was a lot of talk that this is the death of the director, you know, that you didn't even need storytelling, that it was, you just had to turn the camera on, you know, and show suffering and to do it. But to any of you who've read Susan Sontag, you know, as I had, right? You realize that that was the same sort of discussion with photography. See, it pays to study sometimes, right? right? And I had studied, and I knew, and I'm also a New Yorker, and Susan Sontag's New Yorker, and she's really cool. And I was just like, well, no, I know that that's not the case with photographs, right? That you can't just shock people with awful photographs. That there's something about storytelling. So a lot of what was incredible is Clouds Over Cedar was then very much studied and has probably been one of the most cited and studied works. So let me just show you a little bit of this most recent study that came out. So, yeah, you know, in the discussion of why virtual reality, this is why, you know, and it's gone on, there's been, you know, you can go through a lot of it, but there's been a lot of other studies and it's always cited, and it's very interesting to see what's going on. You know, you have things that are popular on Google, you know, and then you have things on Google Scholar. And I think it's important not to lose track of the truth of things when there's hype cycles and investments and things. And believe me, I've been through many hype cycles already, you know, in 10 years. You know, it's going up, it's going down. Right now, it's down, and we can talk about that, you know, in the Q&A. So all of this led me to eventually leave the UN because I just thought there's something here that's much deeper. So I started doing things independently around 2017, and I did my graduate studies at Johns Hopkins University in international economics, how I eventually ended up at the UN as well. And they wanted me to start an MA program around immersive storytelling and emerging technology. And that was an incredible thing to kind of put together. How do you teach this? You know, how does this work? And it really was, and it still exists. You can study there if you'd like. I'm now just doing more research with the university, but you know, we built a lot of courses. We really tried to think about how one constructs it, because it's not just the technology, it's the storytelling of the technology. So we teach you the storytelling, and we teach you some of how the technology works. But as George brought up presence, right? That is really what's going on. And that's something that when you create and make things in virtual reality, or any emerging technology, you know, I'd even say you have a sense of presence now, and maybe even a bit in mixed reality. It's about, you know, thinking of the different types of presence that can come up. And for me, there's things with embodiment, there's things with, you know, when someone talks to you and you look them in the eye, there's emotional presence. You know, there's ways that you can kind of really even move the camera in a way that can create a different feeling of, you know, movement. So there's a lot of things. So, you know, immediately I knew something was happening. But what was interesting is, you know, we went from it being for a select few with a headset, but then headsets became more democratized, and there were ones that you could use with your phone. And immediately we started integrating this on the ground with UNICEF. And I'm sure it's here as well. There's the people who stop you on the streets and ask you for money. You know, I'm sure it's one of the biggest ways UNICEF makes their sort of thing. So this was just a little bit of a testimony of people on the ground, and just wanted to play this.
Once you see the video, it really like makes you think like what's actually going on.
So I have a studio as well. It's called Lightshed, and this is a definition that doesn't exist yet, but it's defining what I think Lightshed would be: the act of illuminating a vital issue. And really, the idea was to, as the technology evolves, to create more experiences and to do other things. I just want to take a little bit, I made a lot of my work at the UN was 360, which we'll talk about the differences. But going forward, it's been in game engine, it's been multi-user, it's been mixed reality, it's been in spatial audio. As the technology evolves, I've done things, with AI now as well. But really, there is something here that is really important. I just want to take a little bit of a side note, because it's happening now, but one of the last sort of experiences I made was on Gaza, and it was a very powerful thing to be there for a week. And this was after the 2014 sort of war. So I was there in 2015, and it's nothing like what it is now. And the idea was, that we had done things for charity, but could we do something? On one of, such a, at that time I was obviously very much into what was happening, but now that I think about it, it's been really a wild ride. But it was the first sort of VR experience in Gaza, and you can check it out. It's on YouTube, and if you have a headset, you can do it as well. But these were some of the young kids that we worked with, that who knows if they're alive now. People were very generous with whatever little food they had. And it was a very powerful thing that taking the success of the first VR film, when I would show that to other people, people understood it right away, There wasn't this, they were like, yes, this is about something more, that you're going inside of a movie. This is a little bit of a behind the scenes of how we work with people on the ground. This is in Gaza. Yeah, so, when you're in Gaza, you realize it's like 50% children, so no matter what side of the conflict you're on or what your thoughts are, it's just, it's a very difficult situation. And in some ways, a lot of this work is what was most interesting after we did that VR film. And this was in 2015, 2016. The most requests we would get to actually exhibit it and screen it was in Israel, So I want everyone not to forget that there are people there. But it is a very difficult thing. But, it was an honor to be able to do whatever we could for that cause, and it's sad what's happening there. Now, a little bit on storytelling. This is my grandmother, one of the most famous, iconic pictures from the Great Depression. And really, to me, it's a touchstone to remember that powerful storytelling, whether it's in VR, whether it's a photograph, is evocative, is a bit more abstract, and is not necessarily on the nose, as we say. But UNICEF didn't know that, and everyone gets very seduced by, in the 80s with Ethiopia and showing, emaciated children, Katharine Hepburn. It's just over and over you see there's this cycle of like forgetting this sort of really important thing. And after I did the experience in Gaza, granted, I was very fortunate that I was doing this very early. Well, VR has had many phases, and obviously I'm more of the kind of boom after Facebook acquires Oculus. So it's around 2014. I'm part of that wave. And a lot of us had filmmaking experience, so it was a very different creative type of wave than the ones before Quids, mostly that were a lot of computer scientists. And I was in Gaza, and obviously people were like, well, what are you going to do to tell the other side story, happens, And I think I jokingly said, well, I'll do something on the Holocaust, because I was always obsessed with World War II and history. And at that time I was at the UN, and I wrote the USC Shoah Foundation, whose founder is Steven Spielberg. So, use my UN email, as one does, and I got a hold of Steven Spielberg, and I said, why don't you let me make something on the Holocaust? And we had a couple of meetings, and he said, sure, great, and I met him, and it was this wild experience. And that was one of my first projects after I left the UN. So I used the email in the right way, before I left. But as I was doing research, there aren't that many pictures, of what happens in the camps. And I think one of the touchstones, again, of documentary is the Shoah documentary, which doesn't use any archival footage. It does a lot of interviews. And, you see these photos, and, by themselves, they are sad, but the caption next to them was that this was right the moment before people are put into the gas chamber, And all of a sudden, you look at this picture differently. And I just thought to myself, what could we do, if we're going to do something as big as taking on the Holocaust? What could we do that, is not necessarily just horror, that in some ways is a little bit more profound? And there's a lot of things with public health studies as well to learn from. And for me, growing up in New York, there was a crack epidemic in the 80s. In my elementary school, there were crack vials everywhere. And it was a really big drug sort of time where so many public health campaigns. And they tried many, many, many things, but this was one of the most successful ones, which uses a metaphor, of you're frying your brain. And surprisingly, in a lot of studies, this had the most effect to get people to do less drugs, which is incredible. I don't know how this one did, but I thought it was really funny, So I maybe that can be an iPhone 16 now. And going back to doing something on the Holocaust, the other one that's incredible, is a graphic novel that won the Pulitzer Prize, the first comic book to win a Pulitzer Prize, called Mouse. And again, it made this choice of abstraction, of representing the different ethnicities and groups as different animals. And it was very controversial, but also very powerful. So after, a lot of work and a lot of pressure, I did something that went further from 360 and did something that we would call a volumetric film. And what we did is we went to the Majdanek concentration camp in Poland, which is in Lublin, and we did. It's amazing because through photogrammetry, you take 10,000 pictures of of the camps, and you not only use them for preservation, because that's an important thing, but you could use them in a headset to then walk around the space. And because it was Steven Spielberg, we had some of the best sort of VFX people to work with us, and we were able to recreate it, and we were able to bring in through volumetric capture and the kind of way that we did it, where the survivor was there telling the story as we were walking around, and that was happening. So this is a little bit of a behind the scenes of that experience.
I make virtual reality films in 360 degrees, stuff you can watch in a headset. My other films have been on pretty big, serious social issues, like the refugee crisis, the Ebola crisis. Most of my films up until now, they bring you into another world, but it's not a world you can necessarily walk around. And this project is, really pushing the boundaries of what it means to be in virtual reality. I really felt this type of technology would be really powerful for genocide survivors. There's this need for testimony, there's this need to share, there's this need to educate, but also to bring you there and to have them take you there. Pincus was one of the few people to survive this camp. I mean, today we filmed in the shower room that he was brought when he was 11 years old on the day that the rest of his family members were killed. And in the experience, you're going to be in the shower room with him. Up until now, if you need to move around in virtual reality, they're usually computer-generated images. This project gave us the possibility to explore with some cutting-edge technology what it would be like to be in a certain place, but also with someone else who would be able to be your guide. You are able to be confined to a certain space, and with a headset, you can explore that space, and it really is hacking your senses. I think these types of experiences, they will give a different type of feeling that one doesn't get in traditional documentary or traditional film.
So that experience won a number of awards and was in many museums, and it has been the first VR film to be archived and preserved for the future in the archive of the Shoah Foundation, which has over 50 or 60,000 testimonies, many of them in video and audio, but this is going in that direction. And I remember there was a nerve-wracking moment because we had to, it's kind of hard to explain, but there's like a committee of Holocaust scholars that we had to submit this work to say whether it can qualify as archive. I mean, you probably know this world a little bit now, but to me, there was a huge amount of explanation because there was a lot of things of, are you gamifying the Holocaust? Or what if people say it's not true? Does this do with that? There's like a multiple layers of things that came up. But thankfully, Steven Spielberg pulled some strings, and I'm just joking, and we were able to get it into the archive, and it was great. But what was amazing is that the technology had moved, Before, you could go like this, and now, I could just walk around, and I could experience things. So it was getting incredible in that way. And also that is the film, I forgot also, that's the film that's in the permanent collection of MoMA as well. But when I did it, I said, let's keep going forward. Now this is like getting very interesting. Granted, we needed a very powerful computer, and we had to tether you, and you had to be in a museum-type space, and distribution was a little bit hard, and harder than 360, but it was incredible. So then the next thing I thought about was, well, what if we could do that, but we could have multiple people at the same time in the documentary with you, you know? What could we do with that? And after doing things on Gaza and the Holocaust, you know, I said, I have to do something fun now, you know? Let's do something with music, you know? And this is, you know, one of my most personal films. It's called Zikr, a Sufi revival. Is anyone familiar with Sufism here? A little bit. It's like kind of mystical heart of Islam, you know, and it's very tolerant, it's very musical, it's very interesting. And just as a little personal story, my family is originally from the Indian subcontinent. My parents were born actually in what is now Pakistan, and they're Hindu, and when the partition happened of those two countries, there were refugees as children, and many people died on both sides, you know, because of your religion. And so I grew up, as one does, having suffered that trauma with a lot of very negative stereotypes of Islamic people, you know, because of what had happened to our family. And even in India now, the political party uses that in some ways to kind of, you know, get votes and to do that. So, for me, what changed everything was my experience with Sufism. I was able to kind of understand that there was a way that we could connect through music. So I wanted to do something that was experiential, and so this is what we did on Sufism. And it was incredible to see people who are usually very shy open up. You know, when you design something, they put on a headset, they went for it. They're playing music inside, they're dancing in the rituals. You know, it was an incredible thing to experience. One of the best compliments I got at Sundance, where it was, and this is one of the first experiences to be acquired at Sundance as well, and it was shown all over the world, and it was amazing. Someone, I think they were just Midwestern type of American, he was like, if this is Islam, sign me up, you know? And I was like, let's do it, man. So yeah, it really, I think, made people, you know, understand and counter Islamophobia in a way that can be understanding. You know, it's a little bit like going to a gospel church in Harlem, you know? Maybe you become a little less racist, hopefully. So yeah, it was acquired by Dogwolf, and it was also presented in the Abu Dhabi Louvre and in many places, and it's one of my most personal projects. But it was an experiment of multi-user virtual reality. Now I'm in there with other people. This is getting cool, right? We did something similar with multiple people using archives from Hiroshima. I started getting obsessed with archives because I realized they just sit there in some website and nobody knows about them. And we have to bring them to life, you know? And we have to figure out a way to get people to engage with it because there's incredible stories in there. So maybe virtual reality could be that, you know, whether it's the pictures, whether it's the testimony. And in Hiroshima, it was incredible. It was in partnership with the Hiroshima Peace Memorial. And if you want to know more about this process, there's a 30-minute audio documentary called BBC in the Studio where they did the making of. You know, it's very dramatic because I didn't know it was going to be good, and it was very stressful making. All these things are very stressful, by the way. And they're a huge team effort, and we can talk about some of that, how that works as well. But the idea with this was that there was in the vaults, in the safes in the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, watches, school uniforms, lunch boxes, tricycles, of chart of exactly that moment. What was it, 8:15 or whatever time it was. All the watches stopped at that time. And they had preserved all these things, but they're very delicate. They can't show them in the museum without them degrading. So we digitized a lot of them, and all of them were donated with a story. It's incredible of who it belonged to. So whether it was their parent or whether it was a sister, so moving. And it was an incredible experience where you're just like, wow, what a privilege and an honor to do. And so that was something that we had, we did it in combination with the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize winner, ICANN. We showed it there. It's also now, something that the Hiroshima Peace Memorial also uses at times and brings out. It's a bit, obviously these are complicated and the technology changes and there's a lot of things, but it definitely was a very powerful thing to do. So this is a little trailer of what it was like.
Fear. It is fear that brought us to where the world is today.
We knew the world would not be the same. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that.
But as it was our hands that created this world we live in, it is within our power to reverse this fear.
So I'm from Queens originally, in New York. Any of you been to Queens or know Queens? Donald Trump is from Queens.
I need to do.
Andrew Cuomo is from Queens. Christopher Walken is from Queens. Queens, good and bad, but it's got this hustler vibe to it, and a little bit, even successful people there always have a chip on their shoulder because they're not from the Upper West or Upper East Side. They've never got invited to those parties. So they're there's a bit of a underdog mentality. Even if you become very successful, you're constantly moving forward. And I say that because as I was doing a lot of this, and one success after the other, I would see it as me getting poker chips. I had more poker chips, and I had to play them in order to do the next thing, because these are very expensive things to do, and you have to convince people, you have to raise money, they don't have any commercial significance, And at this point, I was able to do, multiple sort of experiences, right? So this was 2019, and it was with Magic Leap, which is a mixed reality headset. And I contacted Philip Glass, who's a hero of mine. And I said, let's use these poker chips, And I basically was able to do something with Philip Glass. So I'm done.
I think that there.
Right? So this idea, this was at the Venice Biennale, and it was incredible. They were so kind, they were so beautiful, because I love Italians. I lived in Italy. I speak Italian. I love it. I love Italy so much. But basically, I came up with this idea to make what felt like a floating cube with real grass underneath that would grow, that these Italian people would, water every morning, to grow. And the idea was to have people wear these sort of like mixed reality headsets, but that the stories would come through the cube, And the idea of the cube was this abstract representation of shelter. And this is where I worked with another academic who's amazing, Matthew Desmond, who did a book called Evicted, which won a Pulitzer Prize. He recently did a book called Poverty by America. Highly recommend him. He's a sociologist. And I called him too, and I said, I want to adapt your book, and I want to take these stories. And so we make it so in the cube, one side of it, you have to kind of like touch the wall to hear these stories of eviction. Another side, you sit, and as you move your head, you get different things. So the idea is that through temporality, you get the whole cycle of eviction, like you're being told to leave, you're in the courtroom, it's moving day, and then you reflect. And each one had a different interactivity using, a mixed reality headset that at that time was quite forward. So this is a little bit of a trailer from that.
Life on the best days is hard, and so life where you are constantly insecure about your ability to feed yourself or your children, or insecure about your ability to pay your rent, all creates a level of stress, and that perpetual stress can become toxic.
Messiah had just turned 4. After we moved from the apartment, there would be times where he would be like, Mommy, I want to go home, I want to go home, and I would literally hold in my tears because it hurted so bad to hear him say that, and I couldn't do anything about it. That was really hard for me. That was real hard.
And again, a different way of experiencing it.
I think an eviction is something that a child will never forget into their adulthood. And there are things in our lives like that, that either scar or stay with us forever. And we either channel that in a way that is healing and life-affirming, or it becomes something that, forever scars us and pains us and we struggle through.
So, another way of doing things. How much time do I have? You can be honest. Am I boring you? Is everyone awake? Raise your hand if you're awake. I know it's dim and you're watching movies. 20 minutes. Hey, why don't we get to the talk now?
Yeah.
It's a joke. That was part of I just thought it would be funny. In movies, sometimes the credits come later, so it's a little like that. So look, this part is a bit going to be philosophical, because I've given you a little bit of the context of the different things. But really, when I look at these immersive technologies, it's really to kind of question the paradigms of our life and come up with new ways, kind of what George was saying, that there's a whole new possibility. It doesn't have to be hyperrealism. It doesn't have to be the same values. There is a whole new opportunity. Easier said than done, but this is what these things do, and this is what I've experienced in my work. So there's just, there's the clock. We take it for granted, but there's other ways to do it, right? And to me, there's whole new art forms and things that are really important. This I put in because this was a series of photographs in Adbusters in the 90s of questioning globalization when it was going around. And I think there's constantly so many ways to bring these types of ideas. I think general traditional media has become so saturated. I hate TikTok. I hate the world right now. It's happened in the past 10 years. But for young people and other people working with immersive technologies, they're able to kind of create new ways to express themselves. But I do want to take a step back, Another thing that is a very haunting thing in the United States is the Unabomber. The Unabomber was a recluse that had published a manifesto who had said that technology cannot be reformed, it must be destroyed. And I bring it up because it is something that we have to keep front and center. And so at Hopkins, it's very surprising, but kind of the first thing that I make everyone read before they learn everything is the Unabomber's manifesto. And I get a lot of people attack me for doing that because he's a murderer, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think there's something in his ideas about progress. And in us using the technology, there is a responsibility because these emerging technologies are also tied to warfare, to hyper systems of capitalism, other things as we're seeing happening. But really at the edge of it, it is what is progress, you know? And I think a lot of this work is trying to show a counterexample, but we need to be very cognizant of those ethics. This is actually, I think, a German-British artist, Tino Segal, who did an incredible performance art piece about progress that you could look up. So, as I said, it's really important to try to, as we do this, to always keep those arguments in mind. If you haven't read it, I agree. Technology now, it's getting bad and worse. And this is from the Odysseus, this to my Greek friends, the sirens, you know, everyone knows, okay, good. In America, nobody knows. And so basically, you know, there's this sort of thing. In my own house, I have to, as much as I love technology, I have to put on a timer to shut the Wi-Fi off so I'm not constantly, you know, on the internet and feeling bad and not sleeping. There's a whole new wave of people using e-ink. There's the light phone. I know there's other phones in Europe that people are using. But really, when you work in emerging technology, even as an artist, you have a bit of a seat at the table because you all of a sudden have front row access to where all of this is going and what we should be doing, you know? So yes, you know, you can do clouds over Sidra, but will it convince the Unabomber? I mean, this is just an AI thing. It would be funny, what would he think about it? You know, I'd want to discuss it with him. Unfortunately, he's dead. But, you know, I love technology, but I don't like it. You know, I do think there's so much happening now. How could you not, especially I have 2 children, you know, it's very conflicting. But I remind myself that to be a creator, to work with it, makes me a better critic, you know, and that's why I don't despair. And, you know, this is Clouds Over Sidra, and we went through a little bit. And when I was doing it, I really thought I was going to be the Martin Scorsese of VR. I mean, I basically was like, this is it. Films are dead, and I'm going to be, because you know, that's what we all thought. That didn't happen, but one day, maybe, when I'm 60, you know, I'll do it. But you know, these technologies, there's been such an interesting effect that in learning them and knowing them, you realize that they have so many political implications. You know, let's not forget that Obama, a lot of people would say that he came into power because he used the micro payments and he was able to get $5, $10 payments and not take corporate money in 2008 when he ran. And using that technology, using that way of doing it was incredible. Trump, of course, with new technologies like Twitter, no Trump, basically, right? So when we do work with it, as hard as it is, and very difficult as it is, when you do get it right, the impact is greater, the emotions are deeper, and the scale is enormous, you know? But it's a lot of failure. It's a lot of dead ends. And it's often very thankless work because the market forces are not always aligning with what you're doing, you know? And we can talk about that because I'd say after 10 years, we expected things to be much more advanced in virtual reality. But it is very advanced in trainings and other ways, but you know, it becomes hard when you dedicate yourself to these types of things. But what's also important is not just to think about regulation. What worries me in criticizing technology and being very anti-tech is that it gets people disheartened to want to learn them and experiment with them. Because if we diversify the pool of creators, then I think we'll have better use cases. We'll have more interesting things come out. So to me, I work very hard to make sure that everyone has access to these technologies, the storytelling. We've taken the curriculum I've done at Johns Hopkins and we have it in a Boys and Girls Club in Harlem. So really important to demystify it and to create a community. And you know, the original community of people that I was a part of that created this wave of a lot of VR experiences, you know, this is Edward Saatchi, who comes from more of a political and advertising background with his father. Chris Milk was a music video director, Nani Penny is a journalist, and I was at the UN. And really, we all brought like a different perspective to this, working with, you know, multiple teams and technical things, but we were leading it from a different point of view. So the more we can kind of bring other people into it, I really encourage it. Even if the jobs, we're not sure about it, I think just getting people involved at a young age through it, you know, is really important. So this was the experience, something I made. Now it's called Whose Future because no one likes the word metaverse, but this is something that we built, which was these sort of emerging tech garages for everyone. I wanted to play this a little bit because this was my son with the Magic League when I was doing, he's 13 now and he's maybe 6 or 7. But there's no convincing young people, they just take to it, they understand it, you know, and I think the younger people are, the more native they are to it, given that they play Roblox and Minecraft and all these different things. So this is a little bit about the experience that we do in Harlem. So a little bit about our students. Should I keep going? 5 minutes? 5 minutes? Yeah? Okay. So it's my father. Very interestingly enough, my father, I always feel connected to Germany because when he was 20, he got a scholarship to study in Germany, but could never go because his father passed away right before he was going to go when he was young. But so Germany was always this mythical place for me because I always felt, what would I have been like if I was German? Yeah. I always had this connection, parallel worlds. But my father, I have to thank him for many things, but he got me a Macintosh computer. And Steve Jobs, let's not forget, that first Macintosh computer couldn't do anything. It was junk, you know? But he had this vision, this intention, right? And I think that's what we need to do with whatever emerging technology that comes forward. And he famously had the bicycle of the mind, and that was what's defined a lot of our time, is that let's make things more utilitarian, let's make things that we can calculate things, we can be faster. You know, this is him saying it back then.
The things that really separates us from the high primates is that we're tool builders. And I read a study that measured the efficiency of locomotion for various species on the planet. The condor used the least energy to move a kilometer. And humans came in with a rather unimpressive showing about a third of the way down the list. It was not too proud of a showing for the crown of creation. So that didn't look so good, but then somebody at Scientific American had the insight to test the efficiency of locomotion for a man on a bicycle. And a man on a bicycle, or a human on a bicycle, blew the condor away, completely off the top of the charts. And that's what a computer is to me. What a computer is to me is, it's the most remarkable tool that we've ever come up with. and it's the equivalent of a bicycle for our minds.
Can we use that for our heart? Isn't that what we need now? Is it possible to be more human? I mean, that's kind of what we have to ask with technology. But I think even before we know how to do it, I think if that's our intention, you know, that's our vision, maybe someone will buy into it, even though you can't do anything with it right now, like that first Macintosh. How do we get there? You know, I mean, to me, I think so many artistic movements that are tied with, you know, art are incredible inspirations. The new wave, you know, were critics, and I think we really need to have more creators become more critics. We're going to need whole new ways to relate to technology. This is, you know, an experience of AI looking just at retinas and being able to tell with a high degree of accuracy if someone's their gender just based on the retina, while biologists never thought or knew that there's any difference between a male or female retina, you know? So there's no way to know these things, and we have to figure out new ways to relate to them, you know? We need creative people more than ever. I think, you know, getting people involved into the arts, not just, you know, it's important to do films and podcasting and everything, but it's more important that they work with emerging technology so that they could have a voice. The internet, you know, is a joke. I think it's a disaster. I think it's a failed experiment at this point. You know, that's just my opinion. Someone who's was into it. I think so many people can feel what it's doing to things, you know, and we constantly need to think about what the next wave of technology will do that can, and unfortunately a lot of the people who mess that up are messing the next thing up, right? But we also need to kind of think about, you know, technology in a way that, you know, when I studied Sartre, and I studied philosophy, so I might forget it, but it's a little bit like, you know, existence precedes essence. I always get it wrong, but it's one of those ways where there's always the thing of like, oh, it's just a tool, it depends how you use it. But it is, you know, very much like what Bruno Latour says, we are kind of, they're embodied values in these things. Who makes them, you know, has that. I think, again, we've somehow adopted passive design language of TV that could be different. One of the best VR experiences ever is Notes on Blindness that really plays with the imagination. What is the role of the imagination? How do we bring in the feelings we feel in books? You know, like George said, there is this thing with storytelling. You know, it is the thing that makes us most human. So when we use these to storytell, we're humanizing these types of things. So, you know, in some, I think you need to be more of a creator, even if you're an academic, to really understand. The tools are there for all of us now. And, you know, I didn't expect as a failed UN bureaucrat to become a VR pioneer. You know, if I can do it, you can do it. And finally, you know, one of my favorite artists is James Turrell. He's an American artist. And he does a simple thing is like cutting a hole in a wall to make you see the sky differently. And I think that's what great technology does. It just falls away, and it really is about the connection and the storytelling. And to me, that's kind of how I use as a metaphor. This was a really interesting book. I wouldn't give you the thesis, but a lot of people feel we are going to go into a post-human future, if not now. Eventually, mankind will be facing extinction. And there's a very real possibility that you will put your brain into a virtual world and put it into a rocket and have it go out into space, and that's how we're going to live. So shouldn't we build these worlds? Shouldn't we control them if we're going to live in them and they're our future? Because that's probably going to happen, if not in 100 or 500 or 1,000 years. We all need to make sure these virtual worlds are important. So thank you very much. Thank you.